Great teachers have the ability to instruct at a student's level that is required by the student. Far too often, you'll see instructors that want to make it about them and how much they know and less about the student, which when you are on a firing line or a gun range, that can definitely become a problem. This week's guest is Buck from Leupold, who is one of the best instructors and commands a range like nobody I've ever seen. We talk about some of the mistakes he's made over the years and how he's improved and is constantly evaluating his teaching style to become better at what he does. We also discuss some of the most common myths found in rifle scopes today. Buck is as technical as anybody I've been around. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I am your host, Scott Valkortson. This week's guest is one of those guys that every time I'm around him on the range, I learn something new. Whether it's long range shooting, optics, or even how to command a range, it's always educational for me. I'm happy to have on the show this week Buck, who's also known by Michael, and I always butcher your last name, so I'll let you pronounce it. Buck, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I am good. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I know you're busy. And like we were just talking before we hit record, you've been extremely busy. So how do you pronounce your last name? I hear it all the time and I always get it wrong.
It's Baccellieri.
Yeah. Was not going to say that properly. So yeah. So I'm just going to refer to you as Buck. It'll be easier.
Yeah.
Buck is a former Marine. He's a sniper instructor, and he's currently the military business development manager for Leupold Optics. So I'm excited about this one. But prior to getting into some of the scope stuff, can you just give us a background on your career a little bit?
Yeah, I joined the Army actually in the National Guard when I was 17. I was still in high school, and then spent 3 years in the Army, and then switched over to the Marine Corps on the active duty side. And I spent 2 years in a boat company, and then from there took the sniper platoon in dock, and I spent the last 2 years of my career in a state platoon. Never went to sniper school in the Marine Corps or op tempo at the time. We weren't getting slots just because we were getting ready on a pre-mob cycle and work up, and then got out of the Marine Corps. Went to college and got a tech degree actually in diesel technology. And then I spent, I think about 7 or 8 years as a diesel engine mechanic. I worked for Caterpillar and for Cummins building engines. In 2008, I went back overseas as a private contractor for a few months and then came back. And then in 2010, I went back into the National Guard, went through the Army Sniper School at Fort Chaffee, and then got a call a year or two later, whenever that was, to come back and teach. So I finished out my career teaching sniper school at Fort Chaffee on the National Guard schoolhouse down there. After that, I came on to Leupold as a pro staff. I was in 2014 for close to a year, and then was asked to come on in October of 2014. And then at the time, they wanted to build kind of a training division. So they put that out, and I came on as basically to build the Leupold Optics Academy. And that started out as kind of a weird, there was no really way to define that. So we were doing everything from training law enforcement, military when we could, and optics seminars, but also doing firearms training for open enrollment classes for precision rifle and designated marksman and stuff like that, pistol carbine stuff. And then, but a lot of those trainings were for our dealers and distributors and the individuals behind the counter that didn't have the knowledge that they wanted to have as far as when questions came about scopes and optics and stuff like that. So about 3 years ago, I went over to the military team. And so I still do all the training. I just only train military and law enforcement now. We've stopped with the open enrollment. We've stopped, I've stopped as far as dealer distributor training. There's guys on the commercial side that handle that. And so, yeah, just basically I travel around, and if I'm not doing an event like a sniper challenge event or something like that, where there's a vendor day involved, then I'm usually just booking trainings and flying out and doing trainings and demos for the military and law enforcement customer.
So that probably explains a lot, because when I see you on the range, like obviously we've been down at Winter Strong a couple times together. The one thing I always comment on and I tell everybody about is, one, you do such a good job commanding the range, but you have the unique ability to, whether it's somebody that's been shooting for 20 or 30 years or somebody that's never picked up a firearm, you have the ability to like bring them along or meet them at their level. So many times I see guys on a range where, obviously it's a high masculine, thing, being on the range, showing what you can do, whatever. But it seems like you're able to set any ego or anything aside and be able to help people at where they need to be helped, not so much like how much you know, but what they need to know. Is that something is that something that you've always done, or something that you've learned through like instructors as you've come up?
No, that's a really neat compliment, and that's very affirming, because it's something I had to work at. And I was just talking to somebody about this. My goal for the second 40 years of my life is to counteract the first 40. And what I mean is that, the first 40, I guess if you look at my attitude and a lot of stuff through my military career, my mentality, I think you would have seen probably a very insecure young man and trying to act tough and trying to bow up. And I got to a point of realizing how that wasn't doing me or anybody around me any favors. And then the question was, okay, how do I change that? And how do I make that different? And then, so I think the pendulum swings where you don't, you kind of, you want to go the opposite way of that for a while. And then you come back and go, no, I need to be assertive. I need to have a command presence, but I need to do it kindly. I need to be gracious and approachable. And I think one of the biggest ways that I've tried to approach that, at least in the recent years, because I haven't always been good at it. And I'm not even saying I don't have a ton of progress to still make, and I'm not still learning on a daily basis, is I think one big realization I have is that I may be able to get some people on the firing line, and they might be new to shooting, or they might be new to long range, or whatever it is, a specific discipline, or guns in general. But if I were to step into their world, they could make me look like a fool in a heartbeat, because that would be a totally different world than I live in. And the reality is that they're a highly intelligent human being that deserves respect. I just have a skill set or a knowledge of something that maybe they're not aware of, and it doesn't make them stupid. It doesn't mean that I get to belittle them or make them feel like a fool. And that old gun store mentality of I am what you want to be is really for the birds. And I think that you can always learn something under leadership, whether it's good leadership or bad leadership. And I've been on a firing line enough to watch ROs or watch, RSOs or whatever their title on that specific range, and think, man, that's the kind of instructor I want to be, or wow, that's what I don't want to be. Like that was very belittling, or that was very degrading. And I've had the opportunity to teach with some of the greatest men that would ever, in my opinion, enter, the gunfighter arena, if you will. Because Leupold's very tied in with Kyle Lamb, I've gotten to spend a lot of time, a lot of hours on a firing line with him. And watching him teach is really something else, because you'll come off of that firing line learning more than you've ever learned in your life, but sore because you've been laughing so hard. And he's just made everybody, like, watching him work was so cool several times over, because him and others, I'm missing other people, right? Oh man, there's a million people out there that I could mention. Kalen Wojcik, there's a ton of people that, Cody Carroll. Anyway, the list goes on and on and on, but watching them not pull punches, not allow somebody to sit in their mistakes and continue to make those mistakes and create bad habits, but watching someone like Kyle or one of these greater instructors tell somebody how wrong they are and teach them how to do it right while making them feel built up and affirmed and appreciated it's an art, right? It's really cool. And so I think that watching that was been very inspirational for me, and watching them and being able to say, okay, how do I make sure that this individual is doing it the right way, or correct them, or even make a safety correction without belittling and degrading, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I don't know how to articulate what I'm saying. I don't even know if that makes sense, but I know that I've been beat up enough by military senior enlisted individuals or officers or whoever that it was almost like they were just projecting insecurities on a firing line and wanted you to know how badass or tough they were. And I just realized how much I didn't appreciate that over the years, and I didn't want to be that, Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I think you do such a good job of that because, the first time I was on a range with you, I think it was 3 years ago, and it didn't take long to realize that, for lack of a better term, it was your range, but never once was I like offended in any way. I'm like, this is awesome. He's taking control. And then I started watching you as you were teaching people. And, each year when we go back to that event, there's so many people that come up and they're like, I had never fired a rifle, or this is the first time I had ever fired a rifle. And, Buck was great at showing me all the different things.
Oh, that's
which
cool.
I think is, if you can get new shooters to, with somebody of your experience level and the new shooters are not intimidated anyway and they feel comfortable, to me, that's a win. And I think that's what you do, at least every time I've been on the range with you.
Oh, that's awesome. It's been a battle, right? I mean, I think that in the military, the military kind of fosters that, louder, harder, faster, stronger, mentality. And I know that when I got into the Marine Corps, there was definitely this mentality of like, oh, that guy's really big and he's really loud. He's going to be a good leader. And now that I look back, I'm like, where did you come up with that? What was the logic behind that guy's big and loud? He's going to be a good leader, and so I think the hard part too is you well know there's a lot of questions out there that, because you're at the level of knowledge you are about firearms, specifically like your rimfire world, right? I mean, I would have to get on a YouTube video to disassemble one of your 1022s right now, right? But you could probably do it in your sleep with your eyes closed and upside down, and then just feel one of your guns and be like, oh, I probably know one of three things that's going on with this thing right now, and this is what I need to change. Or like the level of knowledge. So it is vast, and I might ask you a question where for you it's like day one information. Like, oh, no, that wouldn't even work that way. Like, come on, you know what I mean? But for you to be able to go, oh, let me explain to you why that won't work. And that won't work because this, and this, but here's a level of knowledge about the system. Now you don't just have information. Now you have knowledge. Now you have a level of understanding. And then when I'm not there and standing next to you, now you're going to be able to troubleshoot that on your own, or know that what first popped into your head isn't even something to troubleshoot, but you know why, right? So there's, I think that there's an understanding that this is an intelligent human being, and they might ask a question that I would look at my friend who I've served with or who's a gunsmith or whatever, and I'd laugh at him and be like, dude, that was the dumbest thing you've ever said in your life. You know what I mean? Because we're friends or whatever. But I might look at this person and be like, that's not a dumb thing. That's a logical question from their level of knowledge and their perspective. And how do I honor that and foster that hunger for knowledge, as opposed to try to show them how much I know and how little they know, like that.
I think we see that too. Yeah. Where I think you see it a lot of times when people don't know as much as they lead on that they do. And then they have to have that tough guy act to kind of compensate for not being comfortable in their own skin and with their own knowledge.
Yes, I think that that's super accurate. And I would say, Scott, I still struggle with that very much. I come off of a firing line, and the little devil inside of me is like, you sounded stupid. Why would you have said that? Why did you articulate this way? I've had to send emails out and say, hey guys, I'm really sorry for the way I articulate. This is completely not what I meant. Well, how that formed in my head is not how it was articulated or whatever. And, but I think the ability to come back, and I think people, there's this lack of understanding that people can gain respect for you when you're willing to say, I don't know. I think that's a big, important thing to say here. If someone were to say, hey, what would happen if I did this? Or, you know what I mean? What does this mean when this is going on? And I can look at them and go, I've never been asked that before, or I've seen that twice before and I've never pursued that, but now I'm really wondering, but I don't know. I can't tell you, and it's even better when you can point somebody in somebody else's direction and say, dude, they're a lot better at this than I am. You should talk to them. And I think that there's a level of respect gained overall, when you're able to say, I'm not the only, knowledge here. There's a ton of people here. And I mean, for instance, you get on the line with, you're with Blues Clues, right? And
Colby.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I was going to say his name and I was like, no, he has a new name. Like I wasn't like, his name is not Colby. But anyway, you get on the firing line with him and here's this guy. What is he, 22, 23?
22, yeah.
22. And I look like I've never picked up a handgun when I'm around him. I look like a first time when I'm around him because he's so good with a pistol. You know what I mean? And long range is really my game. And there's still people that I seek wisdom on that. I mean, there's so many people out there that are so much more knowledgeable than I am about it. So you're a perpetual student, but you get around somebody like Colby, who's 22 years old. They've been sponsored for 10 years. They've literally been sponsored for half their life. And he's half the age that I am. Right. And it's like, hey, kiddo, can I take a class from you? Like, you know what I mean? Like, will you watch my fundamentals when it comes to pistol and kind of walk me through what I need to change? You know what I mean? And so I think that understanding that you don't have to know everything and that's okay. I think that's a big part of it. I think it's really important.
And I think some of that comes with age because I know Chad just posted a video of me getting my butt kicked by Colby on that dueling tree down at Winterstrong. And, even as recently as probably 4 or 5 years ago, I would have been like, I don't want that posted. That's going to make me look bad or whatever. Right. But as I've aged, I'm like, there's no shame in getting my butt absolutely kicked by him.
No.
And I'm not the first person he's wiped the mat with when he's been on a firing line.
Right. And I think there's quite a few.
And you brought up something earlier that I think is a big thing too, is if somebody in that environment on a range is willing to ask a question, even as trivial or as dumb as we may perceive it instantly, that usually tells me that somebody else in that crowd or probably has the exact same question and they're just afraid to ask it. So back to your point is where you always try to figure out how can you answer this in a way that's not only going to help him, but probably answer it for 4 or 5 other people on the firing line.
Yeah, those questions are actually pretty neat too, because what they'll do is they might even segue into me going, oh crap, there was something else I forgot to bring up. You know what I mean? Like that question doesn't apply here and here's why it doesn't, or here's how you manage that. But also, like that can trigger something. And I guess the older I get, the less I remember to do everything by the numbers, you know what I mean? But so those questions can really kind of kickstart some of the other things that I'm wanting to bring up or applicable knowledge that I wanted to pass on or whatever. But the Winterstrong's a really unique event. And I would say that the 2 easiest people to train on a firearm are women and athletes. And the reason why I say women is because most boys come out and we watch Rambo a whole bunch and we think we got this in the bag, right? Because we just came out like ready to go be gunfighters. And there's a lot less ego or insecurity when it comes to women on a firing line saying, okay, just tell me what to do and I'll do it, right? Because it may not be something that they've aspired to do their whole life. But athletes are probably the easiest to coach, in my opinion, just because they're so used to somebody saying, this is what I need you to do with your body, and this is how to optimize that. And they go, okay. And then they just mechanically make their body do that. In fact, our VP of sales, his son was an incredible athlete and had never shot, I don't remember how far. He shot 200-300 yards or something, but within, I think it was like 7 minutes, we had him out to 1,200 yards. And I was just like, hey, I need you to position your body this way, and this way, and then do this. And it was like robotic watching this kid just be like, bam, this is what you told me to do, right? I was like, that's exactly what I told you to do. And it's almost freaking weird that you were able to do but and then going out to Winterstrong, you have a ton of athletes there and you tell them, this is what I want you to do with your body and how to manage this pistol or this rifle or whatever. And they go, okay. And then they just do it. And it's awesome. But so Winterstrong's a little bit of a unique deal. And you got, how many different walks of life do we have there?
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And I always tell people the interesting thing is most of them have accomplished a ton in their career, whether it be former NFL player, former, military, Navy SEAL, whatever the case is. But everybody seems to be able to put their ego aside and just be willing to learn and listen to whatever the course or whatever the subject matter expert is. They're there, they want to learn, which to me explains how they got to the top of what they're doing already.
Yeah. That's a good indicator.
Yeah. They just want to learn.
Well, you're like sitting there and, like you're next to this dude who's like the number one freaking strength training coach for collegiate athletics, right? And come to find out he was born in some really, really hard territories in the inner city and raised like in some pretty hardcore ghetto, and athletics were a way for him to get out of that situation. Come to find out he becomes one of the most sought after athletic directors or strength and conditioning coaches in the collegiate athletics world, right? And then over here you got Bill Gillespie, who at age 62 just set a world record for bench pressing 1,129.8 pounds. You know what I mean? And then you've got Ingrid over here, who was like the lead team leader for the U.S. Olympics bobsled team. Like, and then you've got Mr. Wesley, who literally was like born on a log in the swamp and like never left the swamp, and he can kill and eat everything to include the bark on the trees. I mean, like, you have everything from like these crazy collegiate athletic, just badass freaking athletes, all the way to the most backcountry, backwoods people you'll ever meet in your life, and they come together on an equal playing field and intermix the two. It's a really unique environment. It's very cool. Like, I've learned a lot. I show up there as an instructor every year, and I take away more than what I bring. It's amazing. It's super cool.
I can echo that because, I mean, we're there as a vendor, whatever, setting up, but I get so much more out of it than anything that comes from the company side. It's just from personal takeaways that I have on all walks of life, how to carry myself, how to, you feel like you're doing something, and then you go around those guys and you're like, I'm not doing shit.
Yeah. There's a lot of people out there that've done. I mean, every time I'm around, even Glenn Everly would be a good example. Like, every time I'm around that guy, it's just like he's telling a story and he's telling it like, and then he'll mention something in passing and you're like, you did what? And it's like, so, can we back up for a second? Like, that's amazing. You did what? And he just is like, oh yeah, that was really cool. I had that opportunity. That was cool. And you're like, you had that. What you accomplished was incredible. But he just wants to bring you in and make you feel comfortable. You know what I mean? And tell stories to make sure that people are on the same level, and it's really neat. But yeah, I'll tell you, back to, teaching, or my teaching style on a firing line, I would say that, there's probably going to be a long list of people that if they listen to this podcast, they're going to be like, I've been on the firing line with that guy, and he's a jerk. Like, he's a complete asshole. And there was mistakes made, and a lot of them, and there's still mistakes made. You know what I mean? So I guess I want to make sure that that's known as well, that I didn't enter into the long range game or the teaching side of this and be like, oh man, I got this in the bag, never screwed this up. Like, like I said, my next 40 years is going to be meant to counteract the first 40. And I've definitely, not been, conscious about the kind of person I was on the firing line in the past. And that's really, I think, where this spawned from, was being self-reflective and going, well, dude, you're a jerk. Like, what is your problem? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you are not somebody who I'd want to learn from or work under, and being able to be self-reflective. And I think that's where a lot of this, derived from.
And I think that's a huge credit to you, though, to recognize that, even to this day, you said you'll leave a firing line and you'll send out an email or a text and be like, hey, that's not what I meant. I did not articulate that the way I wanted to. To me, so it tells me you're constantly still learning and evaluating and trying to improve, which is pretty cool. And I would say we've even seen that over the 3 years that we've watched you do the rifle, instruction down there. And the other thing that I always like about the way you do that is you're very thorough. you don't assume that anybody knows, even like when you do your safety briefing, which I've told you multiple times is the best safety briefing I've ever heard. But you don't assume that anybody
I
just knows
appreciate it.
something. You're very thorough, and and I've like I said, I've told other people that we need to be better about how we do our safety briefings at different matches I'm at, or even on our own range after listening to what you've done. So I want to transition into the actual, more like the technical side of scopes, because I've heard
Sure.
you go there too. And once again, I always learn something when you start talking about scopes, because to me, they become more sophisticated than ever. And I'm not sure the consumer, in many cases, fully understands what they're looking for, or like we talked about before we started recording, they can get sidetracked by what's popular in marketing versus
Yeah.
what they should really be focusing their dollars on. So I guess if somebody is going to buy a new optic, whether it be for hunting, long range shooting, or whatever, how do you kind of guide them through that process?
Well, the first, budget is always going to be king, right? I mean, we have to ask where their budget lies, and that's we all talk about buy once, cry once, and you just want the best, and just buy it once and not worry about it again. That's all true, but budget is still king, and that's a reality. That's a reality for all of us. You know what I mean? Whether my wife and I are buying a new washer and dryer, or whether we're looking at hunting stuff or whatever, it's budget's king. So that's going to be one of the first questions: is where are we looking at as far as budget? And then after that, what's the application of the gun? So what I mean by that is if somebody has, say your 22s, for example, right? You look at, say Colby's setting up a 22 and I'm setting up a 22 from you. They're going to be, like each of us are building a Mamba, say, right? And they're going to be so different, because for his is going to be super competition focused, right? It's going to have a longer barrel, and he's going to want it weighted certain areas for recoil management and this and that. Recoil management's a lot easier on a 22 than say a 9 or 38 Super or something like that, but still it's going to be important, and he is well versed enough to know what that gun is doing when he just feels it, right? I'm going to want one where the barrel's half the length and I can integrally suppress it, because that thing's going to go in a pack, and I'm going to use it for probably finishing off game animals or betting beers with buddies at 100-yard shots because I'm an idiot, right? I mean, it's going to be set up super differently. And probably the best example, the most practical example nowadays would be the AR-15. Somebody says, hey, dude, I'm building a new AR. What optic should I get? Okay, what are you using it for? That's the biggest question. Is this going to be an 18-inch Predator rifle? Right? Is this going to be a gun that is primarily used for killing prairie dogs or predator hunting or anything like that? Right? Game management, stuff like that, or is this going to be a home defense gun? Hey, okay, I want a gunfighter's rifle. Okay, is this going to be used in vehicles and in a home mostly, or is this going to be something that's going to be a one-hit wonder, and you want an LVPO like a 1-6 on there that can also be used for room clearing, but you can also coyote or deer hunt with it if you want? So application of the gun is really going to dictate where that conversation goes, and that's going to be really important. There's a lot of myths out there when it comes to light transmission or durability and quality. A lot of those myths, really, the marketing departments from optics companies really drive those. And, popularity is king, right? If you see everybody out there driving this car or using this product, you're gonna have an automatic, perceived quality that's there when it may not be there, and it may not be the right product for your application.
Let's dive into that a little bit, because I know, talking about like light transmission and tube size or tube diameter, we've always been told, especially years ago, that the 30 millimeter tube was going to give you more light than like a 1-inch tube. Is that maybe not necessarily the case then, is what you're saying?
That's not the case at all. The main tube diameter dictates 0 aspect of your overall effective light transmission. And in fact, that 1-inch main tube probably has better low light transmission. And the reason for that is because when you put a bigger main tube on there, you're probably going to add a side focus, which means you're going to have that side focus element lens pack moving in and out of there. Well, the more lenses you add in a scope, that's degrading the light as it goes through. So a 30 millimeter main tube is going to have more feature sets on it, meaning you're going to add lenses to it. When you add those lenses, you have less light transmission or a more degrading medium as the light goes through. So it's going to cause less effective light. So when you think about simply the complexity of a 30 millimeter main tube scope versus a 1-inch main tube scope, I'm not saying this is factual and this is a blanket statement that's always true, but that 1-inch main tube possibly could have better light transmission than the 30 mil based on simply the number of lenses inside of it. So probably I would say the biggest myth out there, and it's really becoming less and less, which is really nice to see, is that your objective lens diameter does not dictate your light transmission either. And that's been the biggest assumption throughout the years. I was taught that as a kid. I was taught that in sniper school. I was taught that throughout most of my sniper careers, that a bigger objective lens will give you more light. And that's simply not the case.
I've always been taught that too. So
it's common, right? It's probably the most common myth that we're taught.
So I guess if a guy is then asking, so why would I want a larger objective? Why would I want, like, let's say a 50 or 56 millimeter objective versus a 42 or 44?
Yeah. So that is about what's called your exit pupil. And so as the lights and colors go in through the optic and that light bundle goes in, it goes through the optical system and it exits the scope in a definitive disk of light. And that definitive disk of light is called your exit pupil. And that can be measured by, say you have a 3.6 to 18 by 44. 18, say you're on 18 power. 18 goes into 44, basically through 2.5 times ish.
Yeah.
Right. So basically 2.5 times. So that means that you have a 2.5 millimeter diameter exit pupil. So if your eye is dilated to 2 millimeters, you only have a 0.5 millimeter to move before you start seeing that scope shadow creep in. And we talk about scope shadow creeping in, but what it realistically is your eye pupil creeping out. It's your eye pupil leaving the exit pupil. So if you were to drop that down, say to 10 power, 10 goes into 44, 4.4 times. Well, you've effectively grown your exit pupil by double in size. Now, it doesn't exactly work that way. And the reason why it doesn't exactly work that way is because the math only works perfectly when you're on max magnification, because on max magnification, you're using the entirety of your objective lens, right? As you drop down in magnification, you're no longer using the entirety. So but it works good enough for you and I to say, hey, I've got more or less a 4.4 millimeter exit pupil, right? As a shooter, it's pretty irrelevant. It more or less adds up just fine. But where that really is important is when you get into a low light scenario, it feels like you have less light in the scope, and it's because your exit pupil is small and your eye pupil is dilated, right, to accommodate for a lower light. And so you're approaching the edges of that exit pupil and it feels almost claustrophobic, like there's not enough light getting in there. So you drop the magnification down, increase your exit pupil diameter size, and now you have a full scope of light again, and it doesn't feel like you're closed in with less light coming through the scope. But you're actually not getting more light. You're just broadening the light over a bigger area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I had never heard it described that way.
So a bigger objective really is about your exit pupil diameter and in low light scenarios. So if you think about it this way, if you have, say, a 7 to 35 by 56, well, 7 goes into 56, what is it, 8 times?
8.
Isn't that right? 8 times, right? Yeah. So you have an 8 millimeter exit pupil, right? Well, the human eye max dilates to 8 millimeters in the middle of the night. Now, if I go down to a scope that, say, is a 5 to 25 by 56, well, now 5 goes into 56, 10 point, whatever that is, 10.2 or whatever that is. So now I've got a much bigger exit pupil, and it's easier for me to get in that full scope of light. So now we go down to a 3.6 to 18, say the Mark V 3.6 to 18. Well, 44 is the size of that objective lens, but I can go all the way down to 3.6 power. So when I'm even dropping lower, I'm still opening up that exit pupil. So it's not so much about just finding a larger objective lens diameter for low light shooting. It's about, what is my objective lens diameter combined with how low can I go on the magnification to optimize the exit pupil, and how much magnification am I going to desire or want or need in that low light shooting scenario? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that helps people, sometimes that get caught up in some of the different marketing, when it may or may not even apply to what, like back to your point before, what their application with the scope is going to be. We get caught up in so much of the different, you need to have this, which is, like you said, perfect for certain circumstances, but it may not apply to what you're going to be using it for. And I know, like,
right.
in another common question we get, and it seems like one that's very confusing for a lot of people, and I think we hear about it more now because of like the NRL 22 and stuff with some long range. I hesitate to say long range shooting with a 22, but relatively speaking, it's long range for a 22. So you have people learning more about like the first focal plane, the second focal plane. But I feel like there's also a lot of confusion where people don't fully understand what that is and why one is better than the other for different applications.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to understand. I think that right now, if you're going to get kind of either on the forums or get to a range and talk at a competition with people, you're gonna see this overwhelming mentality that first focal is king, and then if you're shooting second focal, you're not quite to varsity level yet, right? I mean, you're still shooting what you got. You're not shooting what you want, and I would say that in many ways that's erroneous. And the reason for that is there's quite a few scenarios where a second focal plane might be a better option. So basically any lens inside of a scope that moves forward or back in the scope will magnify and demagnify. And this is the important part. They will magnify and demagnify everything in front of them, right? And that's really important to understand, because in the scope so both like an inline scope, like a 3 to 9, a 4 to 12, anything like that, 3.6 to 18, all of them, any inline scope like that, they both have first and second focal planes. They are both first and second focal. When we refer to a scope as first or second focal, we're simply talking about where the reticle is housed inside of that scope. That's all we're talking about. And so if the reticle is housed in front of the erector system, as you spin your power selector ring and the erector cells move forward and back, if the reticle is in front of them, your image is also in front of them. Your reticle will grow and shrink in perfect relationship to the image. And that is really nice for a military sniper scenario or a precision rifle series or NRL shooting scenario, because it doesn't matter what magnification I'm on. If I'm holding 1.2 mils left for wind, it's going to be 1.2 mils left and it'll be fine. Whereas on a second focal plane, the reticle is actually housed behind those erector cells. So as you spin your power selector ring, your image grows and shrinks, but your reticle stays a stationary size. And why that's important to understand is because only on max magnification do the mils or minutes in your reticle actually equal a mil or a minute. As you drop that magnification down, your image shrinks, meaning the value of that each line starts to grow. So if you were able to go exactly on half magnification, well, then 1 mil now equals 2 mils per line. Does that make sense? Because you've changed the relationship between the size of the image and the measuring tape that you're looking at. Because a reticle is really just an angular unit of measure, tape measure. That's all it is. It's either an MOA tape measure or a mil tape measure, but it's angular unit of measure. Now, if you have a scope that goes down fairly low in magnification, 5, 7, below that, 3.6, 3 power, 2 power, whatever it might be, and it's a first focal, especially like the new stuff, like the 1 to 8s and 1 to 10s, you drop those down to 1, your reticle disappears on you, essentially. So if you do not have a battery in there or the electronics fail on you, you've got basically a very expensive binocular on top of your rifle, but you have no aiming point because you can't find your reticle, especially in a low light scenario. So most law enforcement officers, and I think that if I haven't checked my data in a while, but the last time I checked my data, the average law enforcement SWAT sniper kill in this country was 58 yards. 58 yards is basically half the distance that these guys zero their gun at. I mean, they're not quite close enough to have to accommodate for mechanical offset, but they're getting there, right? They're getting close. And so you think about the way a law enforcement officer, for the most part, I'm not saying there's not exceptions, but for the most part, the way a law enforcement officer applies their trade craft is they go knock on the neighbor's house across the street and say, hey, we need to set up in your kitchen. Well, think about if you're in a suburban area, right? If you're in a subdivision, how far away is the house across the street? 25 yards, 30 yards, maybe 50, depending on the size of the streets and if there's a park there or something, right? So if I'm set up at 30, 50, even 70 yards, I'm going to be on low power so that I can see everything going on. I mean, if you were on 25 power at 30 yards, you could basically see the dude's belt buckle and not have a clue what's going on, and it would all be blurry, right? So cops, for the most part, and like I said, for the most part, there's not exceptions. They live on low power. And what they need when they're on 3.5 power or 5 power or whatever, they need a reticle. They need an aiming point. And so for that scenario, a second focal plane would really be a better mousetrap. For the most part, it would really be a better mousetrap. And if they want to go first focal because they shoot competition or they were a military guy or they just like first focal, they've shot it enough to go, dude, I prefer first focal, and that's it. Well, this is America. God bless you. Buy a damn first focal. Go for it. But I would say if you're going to run a first focal and you're a law enforcement sniper, you must have an illuminated reticle. That way, when you go all the way down and your reticle disappears, you can turn on that illumination and you at least have a crosshair so you have an aiming point to work with. Another good example of where second focal plane could be a benefit is in an LVPO, a 1-6 or something like that. Because if you think about it, 99% of the time that optic is going to live on 1 power. And if you're going into a room and you're clearing a house and you're fighting with that thing and all of a sudden your battery dies, you need an aiming point. You need a reticle available to you. And the reality is if you're using the come-ups in the scope, meaning the subtended lines like mils or minutes or whatever there to hold off because you're shooting at distance, you're going to be on 6 power anyway. You know what I mean? And then the mils and minutes will all match up just fine. So I would say in the world of LVPOs, a second focal plane is actually a better option as well. Does that kind of answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, definitely. And it did make me think as you were talking about that, something I've meant to ask earlier and I didn't. It's kind of along those same myths. What are some of I don't know if they'd really be called a myth or mistake that you see a lot of people make when they set up to shoot long range that is kind of common with people that haven't been properly trained? Is there one or two things that really sticks out?
Probably the way the scope is mounted is really important. And the reason for that is because you have an eye box behind that scope. And people, they kind of overuse the term eye box, not really understanding what it is. But an eye box is a combination of your exit pupil, eye box, and eye relief. And your eye relief should be center of the eye box. But it's essentially a cylinder behind the scope that if you move forward and back or left and right within that cylinder, you'll always have a full scope of light. But the problem is that if you think about the eye relief, the optimized eye relief for any shooting position being dead center of that eye box, and you're in the middle of that eye box, well, as I dial up my magnification, that eye box is going to shrink up towards the scope, and I'm going to have to get closer to the scope with my head to have a full scope of light or be inside of that eye box. As I go from high magnification to low magnification, the eye box is going to slide rearward, or my eye relief, which is in the center of that eye box, is going to shift rearward. Well, when you think about shooting scenarios, if I'm shooting standing offhand and doing a chance contact, like very rapid response shot, and I'm doing standing offhand, my head is going to be the furthest away from the scope. And in reality, if I'm patrolling or walking or hunting with that rifle, I'm going to be on low magnification. So when I pull up and my head's all the way back on low magnification, my eye relief is as rearward as it's going to get. But then I get down into the prone position, and all of a sudden my head is much closer to the scope, just physically closer to the scope, and I find my target and then I dial up, my eye relief is going to start shrinking up towards the scope. It's going to start sliding. That eye box is going to slide towards the scope. Well, when I mount my scope, if I mount my scope, say, while I'm in the prone position, but my scope is on low magnification, that means that eye box is going to already be shifted all the way to the rear. So I'm going to mechanically lift my scope and mount it further away from me so that I'm in the eye box while I'm prone. Well, then I get out in a shooting scenario and I go to get on full magnification and the eye box runs away from me and completely out of my line of sight because it's too far away from my head. And I have to actually blade on that rifle and kind of stretch my neck to get inside of the eye box. Now my fundamentals have completely kind of gone to crap, right? The other thing too is that when sorry here, I'm borrowing my boss's office and he's trying to get into his office. Anyway, the other thing too is if I do that and then my eye box is set in the perfect location to be proned out, but while in low magnification, well, then standing offhand, I stand up, I'm on low magnification, I pull up. Well, the eye box is again too far away from me. So now I have to turkey peek back to get inside of it. Does that make sense? So setting up that eye box so that the best way to do it is have proper fundamentals of precision, get behind the rifle and set the scope in the prone position that will be the most repeatable prone position that you can see on max magnification. And that way your eye box is shrunk up as close as it's going to be to the scope. And then when you go to stand up and you go to move and you drop the scope all the way down to minimum magnification, it kicks the eye box rearward so that when you have a chance contact shot, you pull up rapidly and wherever your head plants on that scope on the buttstock, the eye box has shifted back where you need it to be. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
It's kind of complicated to talk through without a whiteboard or have a rifle in front of you and have some visuals. But what you really need to do is set that rifle up. You don't mount a scope to the gun. You mount it to the shooter and their shoulder structure because who is that? Do you remember a few years ago, Danny Bolton brought his daughter out, little Zadie? You remember her?
Yes.
Was that the year before you guys started coming? You remember Zadie?
No, that was the first year. Yeah, that was the first year that we went.
Okay. So Zadie was 9. She was this little itty bitty thing, right? And then you set a gun up for Zadie, and then Danny tries to get on that gun. He's going to be like compressed completely back, trying to get inside of where her eye box is if it's set up for her. Same goes vice versa. If we set up a gun for Danny and then little Zadie gets behind it, she's going to be cocked and bladed off that gun, trying to get her face as close as she can be because his limbs are longer, his shoulder structure is bigger, right? So that is what I would say probably is one of the number one problems that we see, especially in the hunting community, because we have what's called institutional inertia, right? If your great-great-great-grandfather, was the one who taught great-great-grandpa how to shoot, well, then great-great-grandpa teaches great-grandpa, and then on the way down, and before you know it, well, if great-great-great-grandpa learned wrong, he teaches wrong. Not because he's dumb, not because he's an unintelligent person. It's because that was the best we knew at the time about the human body mechanics. Literally just that's what we knew at the time,
and I think we hear a lot, and I'm guilty of this.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'll hear a lot, well, it works for me or it worked for them.
Right.
Because that's the way our granddad or our dad taught us. We'll say, oh, but it at least works for me because that's how I've always done it. But that doesn't mean that's the best way or there's not a better way to do it. And it may require us to go back 2 steps to kind of retrain ourselves, but we'll be better for it coming out the other side. I had to
do that recently, about maybe 3 years ago. I'm not sure if you know who Drew Estel is. Owns a training company called Bear Solutions, and Drew's a very, very accomplished pistol shooter. And I'm an okay pistol shooter, but whenever we get hired to do like a red dot pistol course, I have Drew come take over as the lead instructor. And I probably shouldn't be divulging my evil secrets here on a podcast, but like Drew will be up there talking and I'll be in the back of the students, like taking notes, like, oh, that's interesting, you know, writing stuff down, because every time he teaches, I learn something. He's very, very good at what he does. But probably about 3 years ago or so, Drew was out here on our range. And I said, hey, can you take a look at my shooting and see what needs to be done? He's like, yeah, go ahead and just get a full mag. And then I'm going to watch you on your draw. I want to watch a draw from each side and then just shoot through the mag. It's like a slow cadence of fire, and I'll watch your fundamentals. And it's funny, at the end of that magazine, he was like, bro, we got to start over. I was like, is it that bad? He's like, it's that bad. And I was like, okay, let's do it. But I'd been shooting a pistol so long and it had been effective enough that I hadn't been challenged on what I was doing, because it had been effective enough and it always, quote unquote, worked for me. Right. And then Drew kind of rebuilt my shooting position, my body mechanics. And now it's funny because 3 years later, I don't shoot a pistol a ton. I shoot them a little bit, but I go to draw and I have to stop and go, okay, no, start back over again. Like, cause I don't do it enough for it to just be like that. That is my default perfect fundamentals now, but I have to rework what he taught me. But I think that willingness to go back and relearn is a really neat thing for your ability to continue progressing and moving forward. And I've had to do that even on the long range side quite a bit, of going, oh, wow, this dude's doing it differently. I got to try that and see if it works for me.
You know, and one thing that I notice a lot of on the long range stuff, and it might be kind of hard to describe when we don't have video or, like you said, a firearm in front of us, but so many people, when they were shooting from the barricades or whatever it might be, you know, they want to stand like off to the side almost with their chest and shoulders turned. And one of the first things I heard you and some of the other instructors always talk about is, you know, like point your chest plate or whatever you want to call it at your target versus, you know, getting turned, you know, almost sideways to the rifle like so many people do.
Yeah. And a lot of that is about, you know, for a while it was like, oh, you want to square up. And the big reason why we talked about that was keeping your body armor square to the enemy, because if they were going to shoot you in the center of your chest, you wanted to give them the big plate target. Right. And I mean, there's still truth to that. That wasn't a wrong thing to talk about, but realistically, when it comes to moving and shooting, squaring up means I can move forward rapidly and I can walk normally, right? Versus moving while I'm bladed is really, really challenging. But when it comes to hitting a barricade or anything like that, it's about recoil management, because that follow-up shot can be just as critical, sometimes more critical than our initial shot, especially if we have the wind wrong and we see where we missed that target out, being able to rack that bolt, or in the rifles that we were using, that semi-auto cycles, and then we're already set up for the next shot because we haven't allowed the gun to move us. Because basically, thinking about pressures and path of least resistance, you're dealing with a controlled explosion in your hands, and that gun is going to take the path of least resistance. So if you're giving it an out, it's going to take it. Then if the out becomes a lateral shift that kicks you off left or right of the target, it becomes very, very challenging to re-engage with the target, especially when you're looking through a magnified tubed optic, because now you get to see, 15 feet left to right out down a distance versus the whole 100-yard field of view that you would like to be seeing. And so now you're like, where the heck am I in relationship to the target? So squaring your body up allows that recoil to come straight back into you, the muzzle to rise a little bit, go right back down, and you're already squared back up with the target. You can take a follow-up shot very, very rapidly and accurately. And I would say overseas, this becomes important for safety and winning a fight, but in a competition, it means points. And this is where it really applies to me the most. If I break a shot right as an animal starts to turn and I get a wounding shot, I need a follow-up shot to humanely put that animal down with no pain as fast as I'm obligated. This is no longer something I want to do. This is not I am obligated to do this, and I need to rapidly engage that animal and painlessly put it down. Outside of, adrenaline pumped meat and how that meat will turn out, beyond that, just honoring the animal, right? I mean, you're taking something's life and you need to do it well and you need to do it ethically. So that's incredibly important. So that's why we teach squared up, because there's a lot of stuff. I would say there's two real weapon systems that you can really cheat your fundamentals and get away with. One is going to be rimfires, right? Just because there's not enough recoil to drive a 200-pound plus human being around. even if little Zadie, right? I mean, little Danny's daughter, I mean, she's not getting pushed around by 22. Plus your guns, the way that they just geometrically, however you say it, just ergonomically just meet up with a human body. It's just like, you pull a trigger and you're like, it went off, right? I mean, I heard something. The gun doesn't move. You know what I mean? And the other way I would say you can really cheat fundamentals is when these guys in the precision series, they get a 26 or 28 pound 6-dasher. So they're shooting a very small, caliber cartridge with a very, very heavy gun. It ends up feeling like a 22 to shoot. So they can kind of cheat the fundamentals that way. But the reason why Brady and Eric and I were all teaching, and then we've had a couple, JP Gonzalez from 10th group was out there helping teach one year, along with Bill from the Special Forces Sniper Course. He was out there with us. The reason why we've all taught that way to square up is so that whether you're shooting a 22, a super heavy little itty bitty caliber rifle, or you're shooting a lightweight hunting rifle with a big caliber, that optimizes your fundamentals for that follow-up shot. Ride that recoil, make sure or not ride it, manage that recoil and get back on target immediately without any problems.
That makes a lot of sense. And so many people talk about using a 22 as like to train their fundamentals or, work on their technique. But if they don't take that into account, then when they do move to the larger calibers, they're going to be right back to square one, for exactly that reason.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
So this has been great, but I have one more question for you. And this is something I ask all of our guests.
You bet. Sure.
I feel like everybody at one time or another has had like one significant event in their life that has, even at the time, it may have been good, bad, maybe the worst thing that ever happened, maybe the best thing, but it's the one thing they can point to of why they're at where they are now. Do you have like one event that may have happened that kind of altered your course of your life or anything like that?
I don't think I have one main event. I think I've got a million small ones that have brought me to my knees and humbled me pretty hard. Like probably the biggest driving factor and the change that I've been able to I would say embark on, because I've nowhere near accomplished any of these changes well, right? It's all like, I would say it would be my faith. And I would say God has brought me to my knees more times than I can count, saying, dude, you're just not that cool. Like, you think you're pretty big and you're just not that big, dude. And there's I could sit here for another 4 hours and talk about the places where I've made mistakes and been shown grace where I didn't deserve grace. And that has been one of the biggest driving factors in me going, okay, you need to be kind, gracious, and approachable on a firing line, because I have not been that. And then I've had to turn around and realize where I have not deserved other people's kindness and grace, and they've given it to me. But in regards to the long range shooting side of my life, I would say one of the best things that ever happened to me was failing sniper school. And I had to go back and do sniper school again. And what it showed me is, again, dude, you're just not that cool. Like, you are really good. You have a raw interest and talent and passion for this stuff. That's great. But one, that's not enough, right? That's just not enough. And two, you're never going to get to a point where you know it all. There's always somebody bigger and better and stronger and faster and smarter than you. And if you're willing to say, man, I'm not going to try to challenge them, I'm going to ask for them maybe for some mentorship, you will continue to grow. And I continue to screw that up. I'm really good at making those mistakes over and over and over again. I'm pretty stubborn in that regard, but I would say that failing sniper school was probably one of the coolest things that ever could have happened to me in my military career. And when I came back with a vengeance. And what I mean by that is I didn't come back angry. I didn't come back, and I'm sure there was still an ego there because I still had a million insecurities, right? But I would say I came back with a vengeance, meaning, okay, I'm here as a student. I'm here as a sponge, and I want to learn everything you say, and I want to go back over the notes and things I've mastered and see if there's something I can change and improve upon even there, right? And I came back and did extremely well my second time through school, but it took me getting humbled pretty hard the first time through to realize that I'm just not that cool. Like, and So I would say it's been death by a thousand cuts. There has been a bunch. I don't have
Okay.
one big incident. That would be a really good example. That sniper school failure would be a good example. But there's been a lot of those. I have a lot of failures in my life. And if you allow them to be growth opportunities, they've been pretty neat.
Well, I think that means you probably tried a lot of things and been willing to put yourself out there. They
Sure.
always say that if you don't fail, you're not trying.
That's right.
So
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking the time. Like I said, I know you are busy. We talked
It's
about
awesome.
before we
I
started hitting
appreciate it.
record so thank you. And for everybody listening, I appreciate you guys. Thank you. And if you have any questions or suggestions, hit us up at podcast@volquartson.com.